Hello and welcome. This is Denver's monthly real estate podcast, the Denver Homes Market Report. And this is your local realtor and host of this podcast, Ricky Schoonover, 8Z Real Estate. As we take this time to close out season 4, yes, it is the last episode, number 12 of season 4. Can you believe it? It was 4 years ago today. We were all on lockdown. We all thought we were gonna die. I remember I was filling up squirt bottles of sanitizer and leaving them on my porch so people could come pick them up for free. I bought this large concentrated bottle of Shakely's disinfectant. I was mixing the proper dilution and filling up bottles for whoever would come pick them up. They were not properly labeled. There were no warnings, no list of contents. It was just me on social media telling folks, come pick this stuff up. Spray it on your surfaces, wipe it down, hope you don't die. Okay, so here we are, 4 years later, still here. Well, I don't want to minimize the fact that many people lost loved ones. I mean, we did lose over 1 million Americans. That 100-year virus was no joke. If you lost someone in your life, I am truly sorry. I do know the pain of losing family. In fact, I lost both of my parents, not to COVID. I mean, this was years prior. My father, he had woke up on September 5th, 2009. It was his normal routine, use the restroom, mosey on out to the coffee pot, start his coffee, before stepping outside for his morning smoke. However, on this particular day, he never made it to the coffee pot. He got up to the living room and collapsed. My mother heard the thud as he hit the ground. She was a trained medical professional who at one time had worked in a convalescent home. She instantly knew that sound was not good. She ran out, started CPR, called 911, and continued to provide aid until the paramedics arrived. They took over, loaded my dad into the ambulance, but my mom knew he was already gone. It would be about 4 years later, April 6th, 2013, and just about 5 or 6 months prior, my mother finally came to the family and let us in on something. I'm pretty sure she held this news close to her chest for some period of time. However, the cancer that had started in her pancreas was spreading rapidly. I'll never forget. I was sitting there with her. She says to me, son, well, soon I won't be able to walk. This was heartbreaking. I mean, she and I share this particular trait where we both walk a lot and we walk fast. Then she goes on to say, in 3 months, I'm going to be really tired, and in 6 months from now, my time will have come. This conversation, uncannily, was right around my birthday, November of 2012. I was 42 years old. My mother was always sort of this visionary. It was really uncanny. I mean, she would do something or she would make a decision about something, and years later, I'd be scratching my head. Like, how in the heck did she see that coming? Or how did she plan for that outcome? I guess I could just chalk it up and say it was luck. But she was spot on in so many aspects. And to this day, it just blows my mind. My mother was a remarkable human. I know most kids probably say that about their parents, and I'm confident, they're all 100% correct in doing so. But the lives and in the way that she touched those lives, whether it be elders or children or wayward teenagers or even strangers. If you listened to my podcast last November, it was a tribute to my mother. And I really, really encourage you to go check it out. Go to my YouTube channel. It's Denver Homes Market, and look up that episode and listen to it. It was titled Season 4, Episode 8. That was my mother's life, like kind of in a nutshell, at least from my memory. All right, so recently I was in this team meeting a few weeks back, and we were handed a piece of paper. It was an exercise. It was called a brand worksheet. And the very first line was, quote unquote, my story. And then it had 4 little lines where we were each to fill in what was like our story, or my story rather. But I'm 54 years old this year. And I have a story to tell, but that story is well beyond 4 lines. So I had to sort of paraphrase much of what was going on in my head. So I simply wrote down a few little notes just in case when it came my turn to speak, I wouldn't freeze or lose my place. I am not a great public speaker, and in fact, it terrifies me. Part of why I started this podcast, well, first, because I thought we were all dying. Well, that's kind of true. But honestly, the podcast I always wanted to start, and I had no idea how to do so. And I just finally set my mind to it, and I figured it all out. And it was kind of as a way to help me, not just with public speaking, but with my own confidence and my own well-being. And it certainly has helped me in speaking. I'm still not great at public speaking, but I've gotten better at speaking, I think. So my turn comes to share my story. And I gave them a much shorter version of what I'm getting ready to do here. But it goes along these lines. I was born in 1970 in San Diego, California. Not really San Diego. I might have been born in San Diego, but we lived in the suburbs. I say I grew up in San Diego, and that's somewhat true. But the real truth is, I grew up in many places. I mean, the best description I can even wrap my head around is we were kind of like gypsies. I mean, my father, Bill, he was a honky-tonk. He wore a cowboy hat every day, everywhere, even at work. Both my parents, they had been previously married. And so I had two siblings on my mom's side, two sisters. And then on my dad's side, I had three brothers and a sister. And my mother, she had divorced her Navy husband. My father had been through a divorce with his Native American wife. And, before then they met each other, and then I kind of came along. So for my early years, it was my two sisters, my mom and my dad. And we would go visit my other siblings on the Indian reservation. But as far as living, it was me, my mom, my dad, and my two sisters. And we moved around a lot. When I say we moved around a lot, I really mean it. I mean, by the time I was 3 years old, we lived in Idaho. And then we went back to San Diego. And then by age 5, we were living in Wyoming. And my father was up there working on the oil rigs. And my mom was a Sunday school teacher. Then back to San Diego. And then in this stint from about age 5 to maybe about 7, we must have lived in 3 different places all around these suburbs known as East County, whether we were in Lakeside or El Cajon or wherever. And then when I was 7 years old, my parents separated, and I stayed with my mom and my two sisters. Now imagine being a single mother of 3, never really having a job yet, never finished high school. To be honest, I'm not even sure my mom even went to high school. But I can tell you this, she busted her butt. I mean, sure, we did have some family help along the way. And to be honest, there were times, no doubt in my mind, that it was either family were to jump in and help us or we were going to be homeless. In fact, there were times even before this when we were basically homeless. I mean, we called it moving, quote unquote. I mean, we at least had a car. We were traveling, but no jobs, no home, just quote unquote moving. When my parents separated in the beginning, my mother had no car. She actually rode a bicycle from I think 4 a.m. all the way across town to this measly minimum wage job at this convalescent home. In about a year or so on that bicycle, my Uncle Troy finally sold my mom a car. It was a little white Chevy Chevette. I remember that car well. So eventually, I turned 9 years old, and my father had moved to Houston. And I went out there for a visit during the summertime. It was hot and crazy humid. The summer ended, and I came back to El Cajon to my mom and my sisters. And then I was really being a brat all that fall and into the winter, and my mother was at her wits' end with me. I was acting up so much. So when spring break came around, my mom says, you know what? You're getting older, and maybe you need your dad. So I agreed, and I moved to Houston. During this time, my sisters were just a little bit older, but they were forced to grow up much quicker than most kids. I mean, we all kind of were. This transient life was not an easy path. So after a couple years, my mom, she had moved up to Tacoma, Washington area. My sisters had boyfriends and their families, and they stayed back. Eventually, my father and I, we moved back to San Diego. And then things between he and I start to unravel. It was my freshman year of high school. My father and I are not aligning well. I reach out to one of my brothers on the Indian reservation. I explain the situation. My brother Jackson took me in. So at age 14, I lived in Verona Indian Reservation. Then after a few months, I actually loved the reservation, but the kids did tease me. I mean, what was this white kid doing there? Luckily, Jackson was my brother. Donnie was also my brother. So was my eldest, Willie. And then, but he didn't live on the reservation. And my sister too, but she also didn't live on the reservation. I only had to mention who my brothers were. I was just fine. I really never had any trouble up there. Then a few months later, I called my mom, and she was horrified that I was living on the res. I told her I was fine, but she really wanted me to move to her, where she lived with her boyfriend. So I did, and we lived in Washington for less than a year. Her relationship up there fell apart, and we moved back to San Diego. My parents, crazy enough, got back together shortly after that. My eldest sister, and during this time, she had married a guy. She had 2 kids, but that ended in tragedy. She filed for a divorce, and when that became sort of getting to the point of being finalized, her husband kind of went crazy one night and shot and killed her. My parents took in my niece. My niece was 3 years old, took in my nephew. My nephew was 5. And then shortly after that, we moved into a house which we rented from one of my dad's coworkers. To this day, I'm honestly, I don't know how my mom would have made it through this time alone. I mean, not being with my dad, it was kind of crazy timing for all that. So anyway, kind of wrap that up. I went to 4 different high schools. 4 different high schools in my freshman year. Things kind of settled down from here. I start working at the same cabinet shop where my father had been working at, and I end up working that shop for 8 years. I went from being the boy who sweeps up the sawdust and cleans out the saws to helping, install kitchens, install cabinets in all types of homes. And I worked with an older dude, really cool guy, this guy Leonard, and his son was a Harrier jet pilot. And Leonard kept telling me day after day for probably years, Ricky, you're too smart for this. Don't waste your life in cabinets. So Leonard was always giving me this sort of advice. And then at age 24, my brother-in-law, he was in the Navy and he was a recruiter. And I finally decided to talk to my brother-in-law, and I joined the Navy as a helicopter rescue swimmer. That was the best freaking job ever. It really was a great job. I went to the Navy like a fish in the water. No pun intended. I mean, don't get me wrong. Navy helicopter rescue swimmer school was no joke. I mean, I failed twice, but I never quit. And I finally made it to be a rescue swimmer. And my life quickly went from being chaos, I mean complete chaos, from as early as I can remember to order. And when I mean order, I mean really order. And here's the impact. I'm 54 this year. I still remember and I still fold my t-shirts exactly how I was taught in basic training. Skinny, fat, skinny. If you know, you know. And I was also gay. I mean, I knew at this point I was gay. When I was younger, I didn't know this, but at this point I'd kind of figured this out. And at this point in my life, I was fairly openly gay, at least to my friends and just to my family to some extent. I mean, there was no declaration or coming out. That comes a bit later, but my family knew. Some of my Navy buddies, they also knew. And then my closer friends in the community there in San Diego. But this was during that don't ask, don't tell period. In fact, the week that I enlisted was the very week that President Clinton signed Don't Ask, Don't Tell into law. Now, this didn't have any bearing on me joining, but it just happened to be at that time. Anyways, when I was getting out of the Navy, it was 5.5 years later, my cousin Ronnie, he was a fairly new realtor, and I reached out to him, and he helped me with the process of buying my first condo. I bought my first condo, and man, I tell you, that was just amazing. I mean, this place was mine. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was broke. I had no money after paying the down payment and the closing costs, but this was my place. And it was my cousin, actually, who encouraged me to get into real estate, which I did a couple years later. I'd met my boyfriend around this time frame, and now he's my husband. But during this process, my boyfriend actually bought my couch because I didn't have any money to buy a couch. My Uncle Troy, he was a house painter, so he came in and painted for me. And then a couple of years later, my father came in and helped me do a kitchen remodel. And then we installed new floors, and for the first time in my life, I knew what order and calm and proper planning could do for me and my life. So it was really the military and then owning my own home that brought me stability. So why do I sell real estate? What's my story? As I'm looking at this page and it's asking me during this exercise. And I'm like, buying a home, to me, it means so much more than, a more stable payment, a roof over my head. I mean, those are both true items, but how we're coming from chaos to calm, from disarray to order, from a feeling of always seeing my parents struggling to make ends meet, and then running away from struggles instead of finding solutions. Buying a home, it provided this positive mindset. It was so empowering. I can paint, I can remodel. This is my place. I can be at peace in my own mind, my own body. This is what owning a home means to me. That's what it was brought to me. So I love working with all my clients. I really do. However, I love working with my first-time home buyers, and I also love working with my move-up clients where we sell this home and I help them buy their next home. The reason I love these two categories of clients the most, it's a learning experience. It's where I get to share my experiences. Maybe you've purchased a home, but you've never sold a home, or maybe you've never bought a home. So I love sharing my experiences on both sides of these transactions. All right, on that note, we're going to close out today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed my personal story there. This is Ricky Schoonover of 8Z Real Estate and the host of Denver's monthly real estate podcast, the Denver Homes Market Report. I thank you for listening. So on that note, we turn the page, starting season 5, episode 1. And I mean huge news to share. I cannot wait to bring that to you. Be sure you tune in. As you know, the Denver Homes Market Report comes out on the first Thursday of each month. So next month will be May 2nd. You will not want to miss that opening show for season 5. Have a great rest of your April. If you're thinking about buying or selling your home, my cell phone number, 720-688-5110. And if you listen to my podcast, you already know my website, denverhomesmarket.com. Tomorrow, don't forget, is First Friday here in the Arts District on Santa Fe. Please support local artists. Get out there, check out some live music, have some wine, collect an amazing piece for your home, and then be sure to tune in next month.